We're talking about Essay Docha Lotzaseh in the case of Kilayim B'tzitzis, and the Gemara in Shabbos establishes, as we mentioned in the past, that we only apply Essay Docha Lotzaseh in a case where it's ef shalakayim shneim, where you cannot achieve the mitzvah unless you violate the law. And the question is, here in the case of tzitzis, it would seem that you could avoid violating the law by wearing a beged of tzemer. Who forced you to wear a linen garment? And another example of this principle is a sugya that we mentioned in Masechet Yevamot with regard to Ketishas ha'afar for the sake of Kisi Adam. So he shechts a chaya or an oaf on Yontif, which is fine, but he needs to cover the blood. And shall we say that he's allowed to crush the afar for the sake of the mitzvah of Kisi Adam? The Gemara says no. And that is number one, because it's not be'idna, as we discussed yesterday. Number two, it's ef shalakayim shneim. Okay. Now today, we're going to focus our attention on a question raised by Rabbi Kiva. And this you'll see on page Chaf Aleph. And again, it's very hard for me to teach if you don't open up your camera. I'm just going to repeat that one more time, because I don't know if you heard me. It's very hard for me to teach on Zoom if you don't open up your camera. Very painful. So let's look at Rabbi Kiva. You have the place. There's no chiyuv to wear a beged of daled kanfos. The Torah says that in event that you are wearing a beged of daled kanfos, then you chayiv to put on tzitzis on the beged. But if you don't wear a beged of four corners, you're not violating any essay. Normally, when the Torah says you have to do X, take the lulav on the first day of Sukkot. If you don't do so, you're mavatel the mitzvah. But in the case of tzitzis, the Torah never tells you that you have to wear a beged of four kanfos. Therefore, says Rabbi Kiva, I don't understand. How could it be that in the case of Kilayim b'tzitzis, we're going to override the Isur Kilayim for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis? Who asked you to wear the beged of four kanfos? You could have just as easily not worn the beged. And there's no bittul aseh. You're not violating the essay of tzitzis if you're not wearing the beged. The condition that has to be met in order to generate the mitzvah of tzitzis is that you're wearing the beged. But who says you have to wear that beged that's chayim in tzitzis? Why then would we allow him to violate the losas of kilayim for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis when he's not even being mavatal the mitzvah of tzitzis if he doesn't wear the beged at all? And in order to answer this question, Rabbi Kiva stretches his arm out to the Mordechai. The Mordechai, one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, says that there's no prohibition against wearing a beged of four kanfos without tzitzis. Even to put on the beged is not itself a bittul essay, ella, but rather li'achar shalavsho. Once he's wearing a beged of daled kanfos, then whom is chayav b'tzitzis? He becomes obligated in the midst of tzitzis. And the Mordechai therefore establishes that if he won't be able to put on tzitzis for any of the following reasons, let's say he doesn't have access to tzitzis, or, for example, his tzitzis ripped on Shabbos, and he's not allowed to tie it on Shabbos, that's meleches kosher. In all these cases, if he cannot get access to tzitzis, then he's allowed to wear the beged without tzitzis. Why? Because the chiyuv emerges Once he's wearing the beged, and at that point he's an anus, circumstances beyond his control make it impossible for him to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis by adding tzitzis to his beged. Therefore, he's allowed to wear a beged under all circumstances, even if it's got daled kanfos and he doesn't have tzitzis on. Once he's wearing the beged, Rabbi Akiva Eiger argues that now he's obligated in tzitzis. And we can apply the principle of essay docha losa. So the essay of tzitzis will override the lav of kilayim. Sharei af im nesar olav es hatzolas atzitzis, lo yeh mechuyev lifshot es habeged v'nimtza mevatel mitzvahs tzitzis. Now that he's already wearing the beged, he has a mitzvah of tzitzis, and what are we going to tell him? Well, he's not allowed to put on tzitzis. So he doesn't have to take off his beged just because he's anus and you don't allow him to put on the tzitzis. So let's try to analyze Rabbi Akiva Eiger's understanding in his kasha and how, based on the Mordechai, he answered his kasha and he came up with a new understanding. Rabbi Akiva Eiger understood in the kasha that we cannot be matir, the Isser Kilayim, on behalf of someone who's not obligated to wear a beged. The tzitzis obligation is not activated, is not valid unless he's already wearing a beged of daled kanfos. So now you can allow him to put on a beged of daled kanfos, which he's not obligated to do, and violate the Isser Kilayim. Where's the essay that overrides the losas? Very, very profound question of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And now he quotes the Mordechai. The Mordechai says, if you have a beged of daled kanfos and there's no tzitzis on the beged, that's not a prohibition that would enjoin you from wearing that beged. The mitzvah of tzitzis only emerges after you're wearing the beged. And if for whatever reason you won't be able to put on tzitzis, then that's not called bittul mitzvah because you're anus. Like, for example, a person who on Shabbos can't put on tzitzis, or a person who even during the week he doesn't have access to tzitzis. So in this case of a beged that has 4 kanfos, there's nothing to prevent him from wearing the beged. There's no Isser on wearing the beged. As far as the mitzvah of tzitzis is concerned, he's not considered a mavatel mitzvah tzitzis. Why? Because the mitzvah of tzitzis will only be chal after he wears the beged, and if at that point you tell him he can't put on tzitzis, then his slate, his record is absolutely clean. He has not violated any Isser. Now he's wearing the beged, which he's allowed to wear, and you're going to tell him, don't put on tzitzis. Why? Because by putting on tzitzis, you're going to violate the Isser Kilayim. Now we're going to apply the principle of essay docha losa. Because at this point, if he doesn't put on tzitzis, he's going to be mevatel the essay of tzitzis. So he has no choice. John, are you following me? This is a brilliant chiddush of Akiva Eiger based on the Mordechai. On the one hand, there's no Isser to wear the beged because he's not being mevatel mitzvah say until he wears the beged. Now you're going to tell him don't put on tzitzis after you're wearing the beged. Why? Because the Isser Kilayim. Well, guess what? Essay docha losa. And now he has a mitzvah putting on the tzitzis, which should override the lav of Kilayim. Al-Kaini says, again, let's look at the last 2 lines here of Akiva Eiger. Li'achar levichaso, hutalo Isser Kilayim, sharei afim nesar olav es hatolas hatzitzis, lo yeh mechuyev lifshot es habeged, v'nimtza mevatel mitzvah tzitzis. Now that he's wearing the beged, and he's not obligated to take it off, it's going to be a bittul essay of the mitzvah tzitzis if he doesn't put on tzitzis. So that according to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, you only apply essay dochalos aseh in a scenario where if the lav is preventing him from the essay, he's being mavatal an essay. We don't want him to be mavatal an essay. We're allowing him to be makayim the essay to avoid bittul essay, even at the expense of violating a lav. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger in the Haggadah says, but who asked him to wear this beged? The very moment he's wearing the beged, he's being mavatal the essay. Why then should we allow him to do so? Just don't wear a beged with daled confidence. But based on the Mordechai, Rabbi Akiva Eiger answers that he's allowed to wear the beged. He will not be considered a mavatal mitzvahs essay if he puts on the beged. If after he puts on the beged, he does not add tzitzis and attach them to this beged, then he's a mavatal mitzvahs essay. So what are we going to tell him? Well, you're wearing a beged, and if you add tzitzis to the beged, and the tzitzis are made of tzemer, the beged is pishnon, you're going to be violating these kalayim, so don't put on tzitzis. Well, at that point, he's a mavatal mitzvahs essay. And therefore, we're going to apply the principle of essay dochalot. And take a look at footnote number 7, number Zion. He says, meaning Rabbi Akiva Eiger, she'im bebeged atzmo yesh kalayim. If, on the other hand, there's kalayim in the beged, and it's got both kalayim and tzitzis in it, so the thread, or I should say the mainstay of this garment is an integration of wool and linen. In such a case, ein heter levo lovsho. Now, what he wants to do is he wants to wear this beged of daled confidence in order to be makai the mitzvah tzitzis. Now we're going to tell him, don't put it on. Why? Because by putting it on, he's already violating the Isur Kilayim, and there's no reason or rhyme for him to wear Kilayim in his beged. So irrelevant to that Tolas HaTzitzis, he's already violating Kilayim. Who asked you to wear this beged? And you're not even chayav in the mitzvah tzitzis, so there's no mitzvah tzitzis that could be doched the lav of Kilayim. Even though for the greater good he wants to achieve the mitzvah tzitzis and wear this beged with tzitzis on him, but he's not a mavatal mitzvah save tzitzis if he fails to put on the beged. And the moment he puts on the beged, he violates the Isur Kilayim. But often zeh nesar levisha sabeged mishum Isur Kilayim shebo memela eno mischayev all of the mitzvah tzitzis. Now we're going to tell him he's not allowed to put on the beged, and therefore there's no essay that forces him to put on the beged to override the losses. And now we're going to take a look at the Ola Midvarov. What do we get out of Rabbi Akiva Eiger? Lo nitcha halav el b'makom shem lo yikayim es ha'esei areu over mavatal es ha'esei. So in order, the precondition that has to be met in order to activate the principle of essay dochalosa says that if you don't do this action, which also entails a losa set, you are being mavatal an essay. You have an absolute, unconditional chiyuv vis-a-vis the essay, then it will be dochalosas. Is therefore, Rabbi Akiva Eiger understood in his kasha, ein lidchos Isur Kilayim mipnei essay the tzitzis, but yesh lo limona milavisha sabeged. He will not be considered a mavatal an essay if he doesn't wear the beged. And only when the compliance, or shall we say the fulfillment of the losas will make him into a bittul of a mavatal an essay, only then do we apply essay dochalosa. So in any circumstance, you have to ask the question, are you considered a mavatal mitzvahs essay if you don't do X? And if the answer is yes, then you'll be dochalotas. If the answer is why, no, I'm not going to be mavatal an essay, then there's no essay dochalos. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger understood in his Havamina that if he avoids wearing the beged of talid confis, he's not being mavatal an essay. Who asked you? Who obligates you to wear that beged? And Rabbi Akiva Eiger answers based on the Mordechai that it's only after he wears the beged that he becomes obligated. And at that point, we're going to tell him, hey, buddy, you're going to add tzitzis to this beged. It's going to be kalayim. And the answer is, if I don't add tzitzis to the beged, I'm already wearing this beged, I'll be a mavatal essay. And therefore, we apply the principle of essay dochalos. Now, let's take the case of Yibum. In our sugya, the Gemara wanted to derive essay dochalos from Yibum. And the Gemara says that this is beyond the scope, the limitations of essay dochalos because the lotus sheshbo kares. But theoretically, in principle, we would have applied essay dochalos. Now, let me ask you a question. Who asked him to be docha the lotus? Does he have to be miyavim her? And I'll ask you a question, is there no way that he could avoid Yibum and be free of any charges, of any complaints? In other words, what do I have in the back of my mind? How can he, on the one hand, not fulfill Yibum, and on the other hand, he's not considered a mavatal mitzvahs esed? There are too many negatives there, but if you follow me. Hello? Anybody home? Starts with a ches, ends with a hey. After the ches is a lavid. Okay, we're not getting it. After the lavid is a yud.
Chalitza.
Oh, Baruch Hashem, there's somebody here in the audience who heard of chalitza. B'kovetz ha'aretz, Rabbi Chanan, and again, it's not easy to argue with the logic of Rabbi Kiva. Hochiach loke, elagam b'mokom. Even in a scenario where lo yikayim es ha'esei, lo yavar al shum isa, there's no bittul essay. Gam kein hutulo lavar al alav, kidei lo lahafsid es kiyum essay. If I want to fulfill this essay, then I have a right to be docha lo daseh. Don't rob me of my right to fulfill an essay. Even though you can tell me goodbye, Charlie, go home, you have other options here, and you're not going to be considered a mavatal essay. You don't have an absolute chiyuv to be makayim this essay. Sharei isa lalon, sheminat Torah, chayvei lavim misyavmos. So let's say what should I say, an almana falls for yibum to a kohen gadol. According to the Torah law, there is yibum. Because essay dochalos eseh, the case of almana l'kohen gadol is only allowed, no kares. But Rabbi Yodo shelo lavar al ha'essay. He can sideswipe, he can tiptoe through the tools to avoid violating the essay without violating the law. Al yidei sheyachlo tzli yavama. Let him just give chalitza. And shalom al Yisrael. We have to prove the exact opposite of the premise of Rabbi Kiva. She'afim lo yivatel essay im yachlotz v'lo yiyaveh mikol makom nitchalav. Why? Because you cannot rob him of his rights to fulfill an essay. So it's not that he's obligated in the essay in a way that there's no way out. And if he doesn't fulfill his essay, he will get punished, negative points up there in Shemayim as a mavatal essay. No, I don't need that. What I need is the option of an essay. And if that essay entails violating a law, we will apply the principle of essay dochalos. That's his inalienable rights. I want to fulfill my essay. He sof ain't a mekaynis mitzvahs yibum. Lefisha chalitza bimkom yibum ain't a mitzvah. Chalitza is an option, and it will replace yibum and allow her to get married, but it's not a mitzvah. Even though, by the way, footnote, there's a parak in Yevamot, it's called mitzvahs chalitza, but we'll see about that word mitzvah. He says, therefore, who adin b'tzitzis? Rabbi Kiva assumes that there would be no way you could be docha the lav kalayim if you could just simply not put on the beged. Says Rabbi Chanan, if he doesn't put on the beged afal gav to lo yafar al essay tzitzis, because the essay tzitzis is only chal after he's wearing a beged, but he can take the option of not wearing the beged. Mikamakom lo kiyem essay. If he doesn't put on the beged, he will not fulfill his mitzvah aseh. The Ratzon HaTorah, now he gets a little philosophical. Eno rak shelo yisbatel esay el sheyikayim es ha'esay. Yal yidei zeh yivches halah. So we have now a machlokes between Rabbi Akiva Eiger and Rabbi Elchanan Vaser. Keep in mind, Rabbi Elchanan is 150 years after Rabbi Akiva, about the issue of a situation in which I could simply walk away from the essay and I have a clean slate. No complaints. There is no bittul essay. But I want to take advantage of the essay. There's an opportunity and I want to exploit it. Do we apply essay dochalos essay? According to Rabbi Elchanan, we do. According to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, we will not apply essay dochalos essay unless you're in a no-win situation in which if you avoid the essay, you are considered a mevatel essay. But if you can walk away with the essay with a clean record, then there's no essay dochalos. So we're not going to allow you to override a losa for the sake of your mitzvah. When you lose nothing by walking away from the essay, you lose a lot by being mechayev yourself in the essay, because you're going to violate the law. Obviously, this whole debate is based on the assumption of the chuya, not hutra, that the essay is dochev elotas, and we want to avoid that. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, avoid it by just walking away from the essay. And Rabbi Elchanan says, no. He has a right to demand the essay. I want an opportunity to fulfill the essay. He calls it the Ratzon HaTorah. And if you'll tell me there's no essay to be dochel losasa because I'm not considered a mevatel essay, then in effect, you are robbing me of the opportunity to fulfill the essay. For the sake of my kiyum essay, I want to be dochel the lotas. And according to Rabbi Elchanan, I don't need hutra to establish that principle. Even within the realm of the chuya, I could still say the essay is there. He has the opportunity to fulfill the essay, and that essay is there for dochel lotus. What would Rabbi Akiva Eiger do with the Gemara on Daf Chav with regard to chayvei lav? Why would we apply essay dochel lotus when he has the option of chalitz? I suspect, I'm whispering here because I don't want to say this publicly, that Rabbi Akiva Eiger feels that chalitza is a bittul essay. Not only is chalitza the absence of a kiyum essay, and it's just an option within the legal realm, but moreover, by walking away from yibum, he's being mevatel in essay. Yibum is not just an option, it's an obligation. Okay, you don't want to fulfill that obligation, the Torah gives you a way out. You could be matir the issue. Maybe the whole institution of chalitza, the enterprise of chalitza, was created by the Torah for the sake of the Yevamot, to allow her to marry someone. But it's not for the sake of the Yavam. He doesn't get anything from the chalitza. He doesn't gain a thing from the chalitza. In fact, on the contrary, he's considered a mevatel essay. And Rabbi Elchanan was not able to accept such a definition. Now here is a footnote number ches. It's a very short one. He says that there's a Ravid, and the Ravid says that af noshim she'ein mechuyavos b'tzitzis, the eino al reshus legabeim mikom makom ein mutarot b'kalayim b'tzitzis. This is a very strong proof to support Rabbi Elchanan against Rabbi Akiva Eiger. The Ravid says that a woman also has the option of activating the principle of essay dochalos essay if she volunteers for the mitzvah tzitzis in a case where by adding the tzitzis, there will be kilayim. Essay dochalos essay. She can walk away from this whole business. And in the case of Manisha, even if she's wearing the beged of Dalet Kamfas, she can walk away with it. And she doesn't have to put on tzitzis. I don't know what Rabbi Akiva Eiger is going to do with this Ravid. My guess, my hunch, intuitively, is that Rabbi Akiva Eiger is going to say that the Rishonim never accepted this Ravid. We don't have any proof to that effect. But to apply Esei Dochalos in a case of an option, where I'm not obligated and I will not be considered a Mavatal Esei if I walk away from the Esei, still apply Esei Dochalos. I mean, that state on the Ravid, that's the Ravid's opinion, but that's pretty radical. And we don't know what the Rishonim would say to the Ravid. Again, this should not be connected with Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam says that the Esei Dochalosa here is based on the Beged, that the Beged has tzitzis in it, so to speak, inherently or latent. There's a latent Hefzer Shel tzitzis, and there's no Iser Kilayim on a Beged Shel tzitzis. And he applies that even in the case of Lila. Now, I don't know if a person who has tzitzis at night, I mean, later on we'll talk about a Beged Lila, but in the case of a Beged Yom and he wears it at light, according to the certain Rishon, I don't know if it's an optional kiyum mitzvah. But Nashim in mitzvah seishes man grama would be an optional kiyum mitzvah. Would that be enough to be docha Allah? Like, let's say, for example, in a mitzvah like lulav or shofar, would we apply Esei Dochalosa in the case of a woman? Let's say a woman would have to somehow violate a law. Let's say, again, I don't know if this is a good scenario, but let's say the shofar was a shofar from an aisle of a korban olam, and there's an Isur Be'ila by blowing the shofar. Or alternatively, if let's say the shofar was Hegdish, somebody came along and it was Magdish this shofar, and there's an Isur Be'ila. Again, you have to know because Mitzvah Lahenos, but would there be an Esei Dochalosa set in the case of an Isha if she opts voluntarily from Mitzvah Seishas Man Grum? And the way we're seeing it here, the Ravid would say, yes, we do apply Esei Dochalosa. And he says it explicitly in the case of Tzitzis, but it should logically apply to any Mitzvah Seishas Man Grum. But Rabbi Kvega would say absolutely not. There's no Esei Dochalosa because there's no Bittul Esei if she walks away from the Esei. Who asked you to do the Esei? That's very nice if a woman wants to volunteer for an Esei, but not at the expense of violating a law. Now, in the next piece, we have a review of something that we covered, I think it was maybe on Tuesday. What's your opinion? Should we review it or just skip it because we've already done it? You have a, this is a democratic vote. All in favor. I mean, again, you remember that the Smichas HaParshis, which teaches me Gdilim Tasalecha, that you wear tzitzis, even though by adding the tzitzis to the beged of Pishlan, you're making Kilayim and you're violating Kilayim. And Esei Dochalosas. And Tosas was asking, why do we assume that the second pasuk, which is Gdilim Tasalecha, restricts and limits the first pasuk of Lo Tilbash Kilayim, Lo Tilbash Shatnis? Maybe we should go the other way around and say Lo Tilbash Shatnis is telling you that there's a limitation to the mitzvah of tzitzis. Wear tzitzis on a beged if there's no violation of Kilayim. Do you want to review that or not? Okay. Because I didn't want to, I feel very comfortable reviewing, but I didn't want to impose that. Lo tilbash shatnis afilu b'makom sheyesh alecha mitzvah Gedilim Tasilcha, the first pasuk is coming to restrict the second. Kiderech, and where's the precedent that the first pasuk limits the second one? Shedoresh Gemara Smichus Lo Satzali Kiyeshru Yafin Yachdo Shegam B'Mokom Kiyeshru is the pasuk of Lo Satzom will now limit the mitzvah of Yibum, such that if he is a mukashchid, she has the right to say, Lo Saxo, don't close my mouth. I have a valid claim. I don't want to marry this mukashchid. And Tosfos says it all depends on what the chidush is. What would we have thought without the smichus aparshis? Well, you're talking lomer shesmichus aparshis ball lesser kilayim b'tzitzis mishum she'ain soreh. We don't need this drush of smichus aparshis for that purpose. Below makar, even if we didn't have a source to derive it, we would have never said that she can override the lotasin for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis. I mean, if you don't have a proof for that, the burden of proof is in your court to allow an essay to violate a losas. So to tell me now that the pasuk of Lotilba Shatnes is coming to limit the mitzvah of tzitzis and tell you that there's no mitzvah of tzitzis in the case of Shatnes, that doesn't make any sense. I know that without the drush. Why would I even suspect it should be otherwise and the mitzvah of tzitzis would override a lav of kilayim after we don't have a source for esek dochalos? Yiksha Marshal Adayin Yiksha L'Tiritz Hasheni B'Gemara Lahalon Mi Isur Eishes Akshen Nidche B'nei Mitzvahs Yimu Yesh Lanu Lilmod L'Chal Torah Kula She'esek Dochalosas Yesh Bo Kares U'Lefi Zeh Kol Shkein Shia Lanu Shahaya Lanu Lahatir Kilayim B'Tzitzis Gam Lulei Smichus HaParsha. Says the Marshal, I don't understand Tosfos' premises. Tosfos' premises, for sure, you would not violate the mitzvah, the Isur of Shatnes for the sake of tzitzis. Why not? I mean, that's exactly what we do in Yibum. We override Aisha's Ach, which is a Chiv Kares, for the sake of the mitzvah. And the Gemara later on at Daf Ches presents a Havamina that Esek Dochalosa said the mitzvah of Yibum. Yibum becomes the paradigm from which we learn and derive Esek Dochalosa. If we assume that Esek Dochalosa applies even against the Losa Sheish Bo Kares. But the question is, why, in the case of tzitzis, why not apply the same rule? Logically. And for the sake of the mitzvah tzitzis, we override the lava of Kilayim. And if for the sake of Hebrew, we override the lava of Kares of Eishes Ah, then it makes sense that we should do. Why does Tosfos insist that logically, without a source for it, who would allow you to wear tzitzis in their wildest dreams when you're creating an Isur Levishas Kilayim and violating a law? The Tirates, Shalulei Asmichus, Hayinu Osrim, Levishas Beged Shal Pishtam, Im Tzitzis Shal Mishum, Shekayemes Efsharus L'Kiyum Mitzvah, Beged Shal Tzemer, Im Tzitzis Shal Tzemer. And this is the case of Efshal L'Kayim Shneim, meaning you could fulfill and observe obediently the Lotas without forfeiting the essay. I can be Mekayim the essay without overriding the law. Then we don't apply essay to Chalosas. And if that be the case, who asked him to put the tzitzis of Semer onto a Beged Shel Pishta? Put him on a Beged Shel Semer. And if you do so, you don't violate the law of Kilayim and you gain and achieve the essay of tzitzis. So in that case, there's no essay docha losas. See, the Marshal is really making a very, very revolutionary move here. You might not even notice what he's telling you is that despite the fact that we would tell the guy, put your tzitzis on a beged shel tzemer, nevertheless, the smichas aparshis is teaching me that he can put the beged, he can put the tzitzis on a beged shel pishna. Why is that so? After all, the Marshal himself quotes the Gemara of Reish Lakish that we only apply essay dochalosa when it's impossible to fulfill the essay without a lotas. And that's Reish Lakish. That's not just a havamina. That's a maskana. That is a formulation of the rules that govern and limit essay dochalosas. Well, guess what? You don't have to put this beged into a situation of kalayim in order to fulfill your mitzvah's essay. Just get yourself a beged shel tzemer and fulfill your mitzvah of tzitzit. Nimtza she'ein tzarech es hasmichus kedei lamdenu sheish isa kalayim b'tzitzis she'mehechet teisi latira. And again, in the case of Yibum, there's no possibility of his fulfilling the mitzvah of Yibum without violating the Isur Veishasah. Oh, now the Marshal is making sense. The Hainu be ofen shall het al af she'ef shel kaim salav v'esei biyach. It was crystal clear before the smichas haparsha that he would not be allowed to put his tzitzis on a beged shel pishna, and that essay dochalosa would not apply in this case because it's not similar to the case of Yibum, where he has no option of being mekayim the essay without violating the law of Veishasah. But here in tzitzis, it's efshel kaim shneim. Just tell him to put the tzitzis on a beged shel tzemer. So what does the smichas teach me? Now again, be careful. It cannot teach me that essay dochalos applies even if he could have his essay, have his cake, and eat it too without violating the losas. And we're going to apply the principle of essay dochalos, even though he can wear a beged shel tzemer without violating kilayim. No, that can't be. But rather, the smichas haparshis is telling me that in a situation of tzitzis, there is no Isur Kalayim, which is called Hutar Isur Kalayim v'tzitzis legamri. Again, that leads us back to the old kasha that we asked over and over again, and that is, Mimokom Shabasa, if you're learning essay dochalosa for Kalayim v'tzitzis, you should come to the conclusion that it's hudra. We're saying over and over again that essay dochalosa is only techuya, and that we've discussed. Isa b'menachos Amar Shmuel Cheles ein ba mishum kilayim v'afilu b'talis p'tura. What's going on? So the Gemara says, you know what's going on? Talis p'tura he talis sheyesh ba kfar tzitzis v'itiru ba tzitzis no sefes. He adds a second set of tzitzis to the first set of tzitzis. Once he had the first set of tzitzis, the talis is p'tura. There's no obligation of tzitzis. And Shmuel is saying that cheles ein ba mishum kilayim. Even in a talis p'tura, meaning a talis that has tzitzis on it, if you add a second round of tzitzis of cheles, there's no Isur Kalayim. Now, Rabbeinu Tam wants to understand. The Gemara is analyzing the last three words of Shmuel. Afilu v'talis p'tura. But how do we understand the opening five words of Shmuel in the Reisha? Cheles ein bo mishum kilayim. What does that mean? And here's where Rabbeinu Tam comes up with his breakthrough revolution. He says that the first part of Shmuel's statement, Chelas Ein B'Shum Kalayim, is a din b'fnei atzmo. It's a separate din, independent, and it's teaching us that you're allowed to wear a beged of pishtin and add cheles, bein bayom, bein balayla, and even in the case of an isha. Says Rabbeinu Tam, when Shmuel says cheles ein ba mishum kelayim, he means ein b'shum kelayim even balayla. And even if he's wearing a beged of pishtan and he adds tcheles, which is tzemer, and he wears it at night, there's no mitzvah of tzitzis at night, nevertheless it's fine. And that's what Shmuel meant, that tcheles ein ba mishum kelayim, bein bayom ubein balayla. V'chein muter beged zeh, Bilavisha, Afli Odom Achisha Eno Bala Beged, Afal Gavdi Eno Makayim Bazevitz Sitze Kamelon Talish Ula Pturmin and Sitz V'chein Nochem Apturis Mimitz Sitz Mutaris Bilavishas Begeds. Muchach Mizeh Torah Hitira Legamri Kelayim Mitzitzis Af Shalol Litzora Kiyuman. So we have three scenarios in which there's no kiyum mitzvah tzitzis. He's got kelayim on a beged shel pishtan, meaning he adds tcheles, which is tzemer, and ties it down to a beged shel pishtan. And in three scenarios, he's allowed to do that and wear the beged shel kelayim, even though he has no essence. Number one, laila. Number two, adam acher, because it's only a tal she'ula. And number three, ish. We see clearly from Rabbeinu Tam that the geder of Kilayim B'tzitzis is a geder of Hutra. And therefore the Torah says that since this beged is roy for the mitzvah tzitzis, even if you're not being Makai in the mitzvah tzitzis, either because it's Lila, or because you're not the owner of the beged, or because you're a woman, in all those cases, but the beged itself has tzitzis in it, then hutra. There's no Isa Kalan. And as we saw earlier in the Marshal claims we have no choice but to assume that Kilayim B'tzitzis is hutra. Because even without the Smichas HaParshios, I would know very well that tzitzis would be osir in Kilayim by virtue of the fact that it's Efshel Kaim Shneim. Who says he has to wear a beged shel pishtan? Says the Marshal. We have to therefore conclude, based on this smichos haparshios, that in the case of Gedilim Tassel, there is no such thing as Kilayim, which is Hutra. And now we see the Rabbeinu Tam likewise also. Oh, the Isa b'menachos sham. Right, the main sugi of tzitzis is in menachos on Daf Mem, or that whole area, Mem and Aleph. Now I told you, but I made a boo-boo, that the reason for this gzera is because of the fakers and the frauds who were selling tchelis that wasn't really tchelis. It was kol ha'ilum. But forget about that, for now anyway. But the reason why the Chacham instituted this gzera is because they were afraid of ksus laila. Afraid of ksus laila. We just said hutra. I'll tell you. Hutra applies to Ksus Yom Balayla, but not to Ksus Laila. Ksus Laila pajamas, and it's not a beged sheyesh bo chiyuv tzitzis. Even if you were to wear the pajamas during the day, you're not obligated in tzitzis because it's a Ksus Laila. Now, in the case of a Ksus Laila, where if he has tcheles on a beged shel pisha, he's going to violate Isa Kilayim. Therefore, the Rabbanim made a gzera, don't put tzitzis on a beged shel pisha. And Rabbeinu Tam says, "Gzera he mishum ksus hamiyuchedes l'layla she'ein bo mitzvah tzitzis." It's not a chefza of the beged that would generate a mitzvah tzitzis. Yalkein. Now, by the way, if you know anybody who wears pajamas during the day, I hope you don't know anybody like that. But if he wears a ksus laila during the day, again, it's hard to believe it would have valid confidence, but if it did have valid confidence, he'd be chayiv in tzitzis because it's a ksus yom. No, I'm sorry. The pajamas during the day is a ksus laila bayom. You didn't want to embarrass me and correct me. So if it's a ksus laila bayom, then he's not chayiv in tzitzis. Agzera he mishum ksus hamiyuchedes l'layla she'ein bo mitzvahs tzitzis. In other words, he might not distinguish, he's not sensitive, he's not a scholar enough to distinguish between a ksus yom and a ksus laila. So if you allow him to be doche, the Iser Kilayim with the ksus yom, he might come to mistakenly conclude that he can be doche the Iser Kilayim even in a ksus laila. Al-Kain, Bilchatchila, lo huter ba Iser Kilayim, right? There can't be a het of an Iser Kilayim on a beged that's completely excluded from the mitzvah of tzitzis. Aval ksus yom jehud ba Kilayim muter b'deraisa l'lovsha af b'layla. So Rabbeinu Tam says that if you're wearing ksus yom b'layla and it's got kilayim, that's fine on a deraisa level. Hiksha Ramban al shitaso, Ramban is raising an objection to Rabbeinu Tam. Already, besugya saying muvur shekalai b'tzitzis hema mokal l'chol torkula. Shesei dochalos already b'chol torkula v'adei lo hutar isa legamri. El nitche v'nitche rak v'mokum sheyef shel kaimis ha'esek. Mibli lavo l'salos aseh b'kolshke she'eno nitche shelo b'mokum kiyum esek. How could Rabbeinu Tam postulate that even if he wears the beged at night and forgoes the mitzvah of tzitzis, nevertheless, he's allowed to do so, even though it's kilayim for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, he doesn't have a mitzvah of tzitzis. And what are you going to tell me, hutra? But we know that esei dochlosa and kol tarkula is the chuya, and that the source for that is kilayim b'tzitzis. So Rabbi Elchanan wants to come to defend Rabbeinu Tam because of the bir divrei Rabbeinu Tam, sha'af l'shitaso, even according to Rabbeinu Tam, yesod heter kilayim b'tzitzis hu mishum dechiyah. So we start with Techiyah. We're saying that for the sake of the mitzvah of tzitzis, we're going to allow you to wear kilayim. And then we upgrade it, and the Torah is matir the Iser kilayim. V'lulei my shachal ba'isur shebebeged did the chiyah litzorach hamitzvah lo haya nitar ha'isur. El shali achar shenitcha ha'isur b'shum hamitzvah shuv chalbo heter gom af shalo l'mitzvah. I think we've discussed this in the past, that we started with Dechia and then we upgraded to Het. Al Kain Shapi Yesh Lubo Bizel Kol HaTorah Kula She'esei Dochalos Haseh Sharegam Het Tzitzis Maskil initially with a din of Dechia. Okay. The Rambam is not like Rabbeinu Tam. The Rambam in Paragimel Chasitzis Chachamim Gozu Al Sadin B'Tzitzis Shemi Yiskasaba B'Laila She'ena Zman Chiyuv Tzitzis. In other words, even though we're talking about a beggar that you'd be allowed to wear it with kilayim during the day, but nevertheless it's also b'layim against Rabbeinu. The Rambam says, "Noshiv avodim cherotzu lisate b'tzitzis misatvim below brach." Pasav arrived, ein ze ella b'tzitzis she'ein b'hem kilayim. So the Ravid is saying that, okay, a woman could opt voluntarily for the mitzvah of tzitzis. Again, the Rambam says without a bracha. But the Ravid says that that's only if there's no kilayim. We're not going to allow her to wear a beged shel kilayim and she doesn't have a mitzvah of tzitzis. Against Rabbeinu Tam. So that's the presentation of the Shagas Ari. Ach, a Beis HaLevi Kosev Shlo Omar Rabbeinu Tam El Bebeged Ha'ish. Beautiful. The Beis HaLevi is going to say that just like we differentiate between two categories of Godim, one is Iksus Yom and one is Iksus Laila, so too we're going to differentiate between the apparel that's appropriate for a man as opposed to a woman. Therefore, Rabbeinu Tam is talking about a Beged Ha'ish, and it's Mechuyev B'tzitzis. And therefore, Rabbeinu Tam says, since Mechuyev B'tzitzis, it's a Beged Ish, then all the dinim of a Cheftzis shel Beged shel Tzitzis apply to be Mata D'Isa Kilayim. Aval Gam L'Daito, Asura Isha Lahatil Beged Shala B'Beged Shala Tzitzis, Sheyesh Ba Kilayim. Mosh Ksus HaMiyuchad L'Laila, Sheyesh Ba Isa Kilayim After Rabbeinu Tam. I'm not sure. I thought we said in the name of Rabbeinu Tam that a woman is allowed to wear a beged sheyesh ba kilayim, meaning if the tzitzis are on a beged shel tish. That's what I thought he was saying, that if it's a beged shel isha, then Rabbeinu Tam would agree. But he's saying now that if it's a beged ha'ish mutal isha, no, that's not true. Oh, I see what he means. Beged shalah. That's what you. Is that what you're saying, Steve? That beged shalah means it's a beged isha. And the Rabbeinu Tam would certainly agree then in a beged shel isha, if it has kilayim, she's not allowed to wear that beged. Why? It's no different than a ksus hamiyuchedes l'layla, which even Rabbeinu Tam would agree, it's not a beged shel tzitzis. So the chiddush here of the Beis Halevi is that the ownership over the beged, I shouldn't say the ownership of the beged. Let me say it more precisely, that the designation of the beged, the goal, so to speak, or the nature of the beged and its agenda is going to determine whether or not there's a heter from each to wear that beged, if it has kilayim. If the agenda of the beged and its designation is for a beged ish, then that beged has a chiyuv of tzitzis. And if a woman wears it, I don't know why she's not violating lo silbash, but anyway, I'm not sure if he means the ownership or the way it was made. But let's assume there's no isur lo silbash, right? So she's allowed to wear that beged, and even if that beged has kilayim, because the tzitzis are made of tzemer, and the beged is made of pishtan, nevertheless she's allowed to wear it because it's a beged ish. But a beged isha is, even Rabbeinu Tam would agree she's not allowed to wear it b'kalayim because it's equivalent to ksus laila. The fees there. Oh, now we get back to the Ravid. Ein raya mi divrei Ravid shelo kidivrei Rabbeinu Tam. Oh, so let's go back to the Ravid. The Ravid says that an isha is not allowed to wear a beged to add tzitzis to a beged of pishtan and violate the isur kalayim with esek dochalosa. So he's talking about a case of the apparel of a woman, and a beged isha is always patur from tzitzis. El shahasoga hashagas arye hevi me arrived crucial. I don't know. I'm not sure that the Ravid actually authored that pirush on the test. Is that a tesvo? Also, Adal Daito pirush ze'amut Ravid. You know, the Rav Yah was one of the Chachmei Sfarad. The Ravid came from Provence, but he's saying, this is very interesting, I'd love to research this, that the author of the Pirush, so-called Pirush HaRavid on Talmud is actually the Rav Yah. It's not the Ravid. Any event, the Chen Evi Beis Halevi before the Pirusho Le'edios, the Ravid authored a Pirush on Edios, Shecholek al Rabbeinu Tam. Upirish es Xeras Ksus Laila Keharamba. Which means that we're afraid that if you put tzitzis on a beged shel pishtan, you might wear it b'layla lavzman tzitzis, and even if that same beged would be mutter b'kalayim b'yom, you're not allowed to wear it at night. Everything depends upon the kiyum mitzvah. Omnam arrived b'pirusha l'toras kohanim kosav So that's Rabbi Yossi, Nashim Somchot. Mutal Isha Lilvosh Kelai Mitzitzis. Ravid claims that if we apply the principle of Rabbi Yossi, Nashim Somchot with Shus, then a woman would be allowed to wear Kelai Mitzitzis. This comes back to that discussion of the Ravid earlier on the previous page. Where did he quote the Ravid? What note was it? It was the top paragraph on Chaf Aleph. No, let me just see. Oh, right. It's He'orach Ches. Af noshim she'en mekunim b'tzitzis she'en l'rishus l'gabem mikom kohen u'toras b'kalayim b'tzitzis. So that's the Ravid in Pirusho l'toras kon, which is a very important work, by the way. He writes in brackets here, Umiu hu pasak Yehuda she'noshim einem som. Okay, Rabbi, so let's make a note of where we got up to as we finish this week on essay Dr. Los. So we're up to the top left column on Chav Beis. Okay, then, and we're going to talk about tzitzis next week in Mitzvah Hashem, and then we'll go on to some of the other issues of smichus and darshanik smichus. I just need to. Oh, yeah, very good. That's where we're up to. Okay, then. So have a great day.